"Your little award is stupid and embarrassing for this family." That was the exact sentence my mother chose to say in front of our entire family. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside to say it in private, so we could keep up appearances. She said it loudly, clearly, and with a tone of absolute disgust that silenced the entire room. But what she did after that dinner was so much worse. She didn't just want to embarrass me or put me in my place. She actively tried to completely destroy my career. She wanted to take everything I had worked for and burn it to the ground. And the craziest part about all of this, she had absolutely no idea that she was just setting herself on fire instead. My name is Naomi. To understand how insane this all got, you have to know exactly where I was in my life right before that fateful family dinner. I had just experienced the single biggest triumph of my professional life. I received the Best Narrative Award at the Indie Game Festival. For the last 3 years, I have been working as a lead writer for a small, relatively unknown independent video game studio. We didn't have a massive corporate budget. We didn't have huge marketing campaigns or billboards in Times Square. We just had a really good idea for a deep, story-driven game, and we worked grueling hours to bring it to life. I poured my heart, my soul, and countless sleepless nights into creating characters and a storyline that people could actually connect with. Before the indie studio hired me, I was basically living off instant ramen and freelance copywriting gigs. I remember sitting in my cramped studio apartment, the heater broken in the middle of winter, typing out character dialogue while wearing cheap winter gloves. There were so many times I almost quit. So many times I looked at my bank account and thought my mother was right. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe writing stories for video games wasn't a real path for a functioning adult, but I kept pushing. I took a job at the indie studio for barely minimum wage because I believed in the project. We all did. The core team was just 5 people crammed into a rented office space that always smelled vaguely of damp carpet and stale coffee. We debated story arcs over cheap pizza at 2 in the morning. We cried together when the game engine kept crashing a week before our alpha release. It wasn't just a job for us. It was survival. When the game finally launched, we were just hoping to break even. We honestly just wanted enough people to buy it, so the studio wouldn't have to close its doors and we wouldn't all be out on the street. But then something crazy happened. People loved it. Big streamers started playing it on Twitch and YouTube. Word of mouth spread like wildfire across social media. Within a few short months, the game I wrote sold over 1 million copies. 1 million. I still remember the exact moment my boss, David, called me to tell me the numbers. His voice was shaking. I dropped my phone on the floor and just sat on my bed, staring blankly at the wall. My words, my characters, my story, 1 million people had experienced it. It felt like a dream that I was terrified to wake up from. Then came the award season. The Indie Game Festival is basically the Oscars for developers like us. When I was sitting in that auditorium, and they read out the nominees for the Best Narrative Award, my heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I thought I was going to pass out. And then, they called my name. I walked up on that stage, my hands shaking violently, and held this heavy, beautiful glass trophy. I gave an acceptance speech, I don't even remember, because I was crying too much. It was the absolute peak of my life. After the festival, my professional life completely exploded in the best way possible. I wasn't just a struggling writer anymore. I was an award-winning narrative designer with a massive, undeniable hit under my belt. My email inbox was flooded with incredible opportunities. I was invited to do exclusive interviews with top gaming journalists and magazines. Convention organizers from all over the world were reaching out to the studio, asking if I could fly out to be on writing panels. I even got a prestigious invitation to give a keynote talk at one of the biggest developer conferences in the entire country. Everything was happening so incredibly fast. I was 27 years old, and I had finally made it. Naturally, when you achieve something that big, the first thing you want to do is share it with the people you love. You want your family to see you succeed. You want them to finally validate your choices. My family organized a big dinner to celebrate. Or at least, that is what I was explicitly told the dinner was for. I had called my mom, Victoria, the morning after I got back from the festival. I told her all about the award, the insane sales numbers, the upcoming interviews, everything. Growing up, Victoria made it very clear that art was not a real career. When I decided to pursue creative writing and game design in college, she flat out refused to support me. She told me I was throwing my life away to play with toys. I worked multiple exhausting jobs to put myself through school and survive, just to prove her wrong. And now, I finally had the ultimate proof. Even my mother couldn't ignore 1 million copies sold and an international award. I honestly, truly thought my mom would finally be proud of me. I thought this dinner was going to be the moment she looked at me across the table and said, "You did it. I was wrong, and I'm proud of the path you chose." I spent the rest of the week prepping for the family dinner. I went out and bought a nice new outfit, something conservative enough for my mother's strict tastes, but nice enough to make me feel confident. I carefully packed my glass trophy into a padded box so I could show it to everyone safely. I just wanted one single night of feeling validated by my own blood. Looking back now, I feel so incredibly stupid for being that hopeful. I should have known better. Victoria never liked anything I did unless she could personally take credit for it. I arrived at my parents' house at exactly 6 p.m. on Saturday. The driveway was already full of cars. I could hear laughing and talking coming from inside the house. I took a deep breath, grabbed the box with my award, and walked up to the front door. I pushed the door open. The warm smell of roast beef and garlic mashed potatoes hit me immediately. My aunt and uncle were sitting in the living room, and my cousin Chloe was standing by the fireplace, looking flawless as usual. Chloe was a high-powered corporate lawyer, making insane money, and my mother never missed an opportunity to remind me of that fact. "Naomi's here," my aunt called out, walking over to give me a tight hug. "We heard you won some kind of computer contest. That's so fun for you." It wasn't a computer contest, but I smiled anyway. "Thanks, Aunt Sarah. It's actually a global industry award for a game I wrote." "Oh, right, the little game," my mom said, walking out of the kitchen and wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't hug me. She didn't even say hello. She just looked at the box in my hands. "Is that the trophy? Put it on the side table. Don't scratch the glass. We're about to eat." I swallowed the tight knot forming in my throat and set the box down. I unpacked the award and placed it carefully on the table. We all moved to the dining room to start the meal. Dinner started off normal enough. We talked about my uncle's golf trips and spent a solid 20 minutes dedicated to Chloe's latest corporate court case. I sat there quietly, eating my food, just waiting for the moment the conversation would turn to me. I wasn't trying to be the center of attention, but my mom had explicitly called this a celebration for my success. Finally, my uncle looked at me and asked about the game. I smiled, putting my fork down, ready to share the best news of my life with the people who were supposed to love me the most. I was so full of joy, completely unaware that the nightmare was just about to begin. My Uncle Bob looked at me, taking a long sip of his ice water, and asked, "So, Naomi, tell us about this little computer thing you won. How does that even work? Do you just type code all day or what?" I smiled, genuinely excited, putting my fork down next to my plate of roast beef. I was so incredibly ready to share everything. I opened my mouth to explain the massive sales numbers, the deep narrative design of the characters, the sheer scale of what our small indie team had accomplished over the last 3 years. But before I could even get 3 words out, my mother slammed her water glass down on the table. The sharp clinking sound made everyone freeze. She looked at me from across the table, her eyes completely devoid of any maternal warmth or pride. In front of all our relatives, she bluntly stated that playing games and writing stories for games is not a real job. She said it with such absolute conviction, as if she were stating a universal fact like the sky is blue or water is wet. The entire dining room went dead silent. The warm, inviting atmosphere I had felt just moments before instantly evaporated into thin air. Nobody knew where to look. Then, the awkward, uncomfortable laughter started bubbling up around the table. My aunt nervously adjusted her cloth napkin, while my Uncle Bob suddenly became very interested in pushing his mashed potatoes around his plate. I looked over at my cousin Chloe, hoping for just a tiny ounce of solidarity from someone close to my age. Instead, Chloe casually swirled the red wine in her glass, gave me a condescending, pitying little smile, and loudly agreed that, yeah, those things are childish. She actually said that out loud. The high-powered corporate lawyer sitting there in her expensive designer dress, completely dismissing 3 years of my blood, sweat, and tears as if I were a toddler playing in a sandbox. I felt a hot, humiliating flush creep up my neck and spread across my cheeks. I was profoundly hurt, my chest tight with a heavy mixture of anger and deep embarrassment, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and just try to ignore it. I didn't want to give my mother the satisfaction of seeing me cry, and I didn't want to cause a massive screaming match that would ruin the rest of the night. I spent the remainder of the dinner staring down at my plate, giving short, one-word answers until I could finally make my polite excuses, grab my things, and leave. When I got back to my apartment that night, I carefully unpacked my heavy glass trophy and set it on my desk. I looked at it for a long, quiet time. I told myself that my family's ignorance didn't diminish my achievements in the real world. I had a strong community that respected me, a studio that valued my creative input, and a growing, passionate fanbase that loved my work. I decided right then and there to just put the disastrous, hurtful dinner behind me and focus entirely on the bright future ahead. I thought that was the absolute end of it. I thought my mother's cruelty was strictly confined to that dining room table, that I was so incredibly wrong. Exactly 1 week later, the real nightmare began. It was a typical Tuesday morning at the indie studio. We were all crammed into our small, bright office space, drinking cheap coffee and brainstorming new storylines for the game's first major expansion pack. The creative energy was high, and we were all still riding the incredible momentum of our recent award win. Around 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed on my desk. It was my studio calling me, specifically my boss, David. This was exceptionally weird because David was sitting just 3 desks away from me in the open plan room. I looked over at him, and his face was completely pale. All the color had drained from his cheeks. He wasn't smiling at all. He subtly gestured for me to follow him into the small, glass-walled conference room we used for private, serious meetings that I walked in and sat down, a sudden, heavy knot forming deep in my stomach. The lead programmer and the studio's co-founder were already sitting there, looking extremely grim and tense. David closed the door behind me and pulled the privacy blinds shut. "Naomi, we have a massive urgent problem," David said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. He turned his laptop around and pushed it across the wooden table toward me. I squinted at the screen. It was an email inbox. "What is this?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster against my ribs. David took a deep, shaky breath. He explained that earlier that morning, they had received a series of highly detailed, anonymous emails explicitly accusing me of plagiarism and stealing the core game ideas. I stared at him, completely paralyzed. The words didn't even make sense in my brain. Plagiarism. In the tight-knit indie gaming world, your reputation is absolutely everything you have. If you are branded a thief or a lazy copycat, your career is over instantly. No one will ever work with you, buy your games, or trust your creative vision ever again. I frantically scrolled through the emails. The sender had gone to extreme, obsessive lengths. They had written long, convoluted paragraphs claiming that my award-winning narrative was stolen from an obscure, unpublished manuscript. It was entirely fabricated, a complete and total lie from start to finish. But the sheer volume and aggressive, professional tone of the messages were terrifying. "David, this is insane. This is a complete lie. You know I wrote every single word of this game. You watched me write it for 3 years." I pleaded, my voice cracking with rising panic. "I know, Naomi. We all know," David said softly, running a hand through his hair in frustration. But that's not the worst part. He clicked on another tab on his internet browser. These emails didn't just go to our internal studio inbox. The sender blasted them everywhere to cause maximum damage. They sent these vicious accusations directly to our game publisher, several major game journalists, and even the award organizers at the Indie Game Festival. The floor felt like it was dropping out from underneath me. My publisher, the prestigious journalists who were supposed to interview me next week, the festival committee who just handed me a glass trophy in front of thousands of people. My mind started racing with catastrophic, terrifying thoughts. They were going to pull the game from the digital storefronts. They were going to publicly strip me of my award. My entire life, everything I had sacrificed for over the last 3 years, was actively being burned to the ground by an anonymous coward hiding behind a keyboard. "We are not going to let this happen without a fight," David said firmly, snapping me out of my dark spiral. The studio immediately started an internal investigation to figure out exactly where the hell these emails came from. We have our lead network guy looking into the headers and the digital footprint right now. Whoever did this was highly malicious, but they weren't exactly a master cybersecurity expert. For the next 3 agonizing hours, I sat in that conference room, physically shaking, while our IT guy worked his magic on the network logs. I kept racking my brain, trying desperately to think of anyone who would hate me enough to do something this vile. A disgruntled former employee, a rival indie studio trying to sabotage our massive sales, an internet troll who just hated women in the gaming industry. None of it made any logical sense. I was generally well-liked in the community. I didn't have any real enemies. Then, the IT guy knocked on the conference room door and slowly walked in. He was holding a single piece of printed paper. He looked at David, then looked at me with an expression of deep, incredibly uncomfortable pity. I traced the digital footprint of the anonymous sender, he said quietly, almost a whisper. I pulled the IP logs from the email headers. It took a bit of digging, but it wasn't heavily masked. He slid the piece of paper across the smooth table to me. I looked down at the sequence of numbers and the corresponding physical address printed clearly next to it. I stopped breathing entirely. The address on the paper was a nice, suburban house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. It was the exact house I had grown up in. The IP address for the malicious, career-destroying emails traced directly back to my mother's house. The room was incredibly, suffocatingly quiet. David and the others just stared at me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to say something. I looked at the paper, then back at them, then back at the paper. My brain completely short-circuited. It was physically impossible for my mind to process the horrific information it was receiving. I was entirely in denial, shaking my head and stammering that it had to be a massive mistake, because I absolutely did not believe she would actually do something like this. Yes, she was cruel. Yes, she was unsupportive and mean and incredibly dismissive at dinner. But intentionally trying to ruin my life, destroy my career, and humiliate me on a global scale? No, that wasn't just mean. That was pure, calculated evil. There had to be another explanation. Maybe someone hacked her Wi-Fi network. Maybe it was a crazy, unbelievable coincidence. It couldn't be her. It just couldn't be my own mother. I didn't even wait for the end of the workday. I grabbed my keys, walked right out of the studio, and I drove straight to my parents' house to ask my mother about the IP address. The entire 30-minute drive felt like an absolute blur. My hands are gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned completely white, and my heart was hammering against my ribs. I kept running through a million different scenarios in my head, desperately hoping she had a valid, logical excuse. Maybe she had a terrible computer virus. Maybe a neighbor was secretly using her wireless network. I needed her to look me in the eye and tell me that she didn't actively try to destroy my entire life. When I finally pulled into the driveway, her car was parked in its usual spot. I marched right up to the front door and unlocked it with my old spare key. She was sitting comfortably in the living room, casually flipping through a glossy lifestyle magazine with a hot cup of herbal tea resting on the glass coffee table. She looked up, mildly annoyed by my sudden intrusion, but she didn't seem surprised. I didn't yell or scream at first. I just stood there in the doorway, physically shaking from the adrenaline, and asked her point-blank if she had sent those vicious emails to my publisher and the festival organizers. I showed her the printed paper with her IP address highlighted in bright yellow ink. I stood there and waited for the shock, the denial, the confusion. Instead, I got absolutely nothing. When I confronted her, Victoria did not apologize at all. She didn't even look remotely guilty or embarrassed about being caught. She slowly closed her magazine, set it down next to her tea, and looked at me with a cold, terrifyingly calm expression. She looked me dead in the eye and said she just wanted people to know I was not the genius they thought I was. Hearing those exact words come out of my own mother's mouth felt like taking a physical bullet directly to the chest. I asked her why she would ever do something so incredibly evil and malicious to her own flesh and blood. She didn't flinch, and she told me I was becoming too arrogant. In her twisted, deeply controlling mind, my genuine excitement over selling 1 million copies and winning an international award wasn't an achievement to be celebrated. It was a severe character flaw that needed to be violently corrected. She firmly believed that a daughter needs to be brought down a notch. That I realized right then and there that she didn't see me as an independent adult or a successful professional in my own right. She just saw me as a rebellious, disobedient child who had managed to prove her wrong, and she absolutely hated me for it. I didn't try to argue with her. I didn't cry in front of her to give her the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I simply turned around, walked out the front door, and drove back to my tiny apartment in complete, suffocating silence. But the damage was already done, and the toxic fallout was spreading faster than any of us could contain. Within days, the vicious rumors began to spread rapidly across the industry. The gaming community is incredibly connected, and bad news travels at the absolute speed of light. Anonymous forums and giant social media platforms picked up on the leaked emails. People started deeply analyzing my game, aggressively tearing apart the storyline, and looking for any possible similarity to other obscure works to validate the fabricated claims. Influential online commentators and streamers who had previously praised my writing were suddenly making long, dramatic videos discussing the massive plagiarism controversy. My professional inbox went from being filled with exciting interview requests to being completely flooded with angry, disappointed messages from fans who felt entirely betrayed by my supposed lies. The professional consequences were immediate and absolutely terrifying. Because of the scandal, I almost lost my upcoming contracts and my precious award. Our massive game publisher called an emergency, high-stakes meeting with David and the studio executives, aggressively threatening to pull their entire financial backing for our highly anticipated expansion pack. They bluntly stated that they couldn't afford to be associated with stolen intellectual property. The festival organizers also reached out to my team, formally stating that they were reviewing my Best Narrative Award and might have to publicly revoke it if the horrific allegations proved to be true. My entire career, everything I had built from absolutely nothing over the last 3 grueling years, was hanging by a microscopic thread. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I just sat in my apartment, watching my life's work get violently dragged through the mud just because my mother couldn't handle the fact that I had succeeded without her permission. The studio told me to take a few days off to protect my mental health, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. However, my studio refused to give up and decided to investigate the matter thoroughly. David and the rest of the core team knew exactly who I was as a writer. They had seen the original, messy drafts, the chaotic whiteboard brainstorming sessions at 2 a.m, and the countless, exhausting revisions I had done over the years. They knew the accusations were entirely baseless, but in the strict corporate world, simply knowing the truth isn't enough. You have to undeniably, legally prove it. David used the studio's emergency funds to hire an independent, highly skilled IT forensic expert to dig much deeper into the anonymous emails and the supposed original manuscript my mother had sent to the journalists. The expert spent 4 exhausting, non-stop days combing through the digital metadata, the hidden file histories, and the complex digital signatures attached to the documents my mother had provided as absolute proof of my theft. What they ultimately found was so much worse than just a few angry, anonymous emails. The expert called us all back into the glass-walled conference room. The atmosphere was incredibly tense and heavy. He projected his laptop screen onto the white wall, showing complex lines of code and document properties that I barely understood. He explained that our IT forensic expert discovered that Victoria did not just send those anonymous emails. She had gone to extreme, methodical, and obsessive lengths to completely ruin me. She had actually edited documents. The expert showed us exactly how she had taken an old, discarded backup file of my early college writing notes, something I had left on a forgotten external hard drive at her house years ago, and maliciously manipulated the text. She went as far as creating fake evidence to prove that I had committed plagiarism. She had purposely and carefully altered the digital creation dates on the files to make it look like her fabricated manuscript existed long before I ever started working at the indie studio. It was a highly calculated, incredibly malicious attempt to frame me for a career-ending offense. She had meticulously pieced together this massive, undeniable lie, knowing exactly how much catastrophic damage it would cause to my life. The conference room was absolutely silent as the expert finished his dark presentation. David slowly rubbed his temples, letting out a long, incredibly heavy sigh. He turned to the studio's legal counsel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room taking furious notes. The lawyer looked up, closed his leather notebook, and delivered the final, devastating blow. The studio's lawyer informed us that this level of fabrication was clear defamation and fraud. This wasn't just a petty family dispute anymore. This wasn't just a bitter mother being cruel to her successful daughter. This was a severe, actionable, and highly destructive crime. By maliciously altering private documents, creating fraudulent evidence, and distributing it to our vital business partners and the press to intentionally cause financial and professional harm, my mother had crossed a massive legal line. The lawyer calmly explained that the studio had a strict fiduciary duty to protect its intellectual property, its massive financial investments, and its employees. They had the absolute legal right to sue her for immense financial damages, and the local authorities could potentially bring severe criminal charges against her for the fraudulent documents. That I sat there, staring blankly at the projected screen on the wall, feeling completely numb inside. The woman who gave birth to me, the woman who raised me, was now facing serious, life-altering legal consequences simply because she couldn't bear to be happy for my success. She had painstakingly built a massive trap to destroy my life, but she had accidentally locked herself inside it instead. I knew exactly what had to happen next, and I knew it was going to be the hardest, most defining moment of my entire life. Defamation and fraud. Those three specific words hung heavily in the stale air of our glass-walled conference room, sitting on my chest like a physical, suffocating weight. The studio's legal counsel, a sharp, incredibly pragmatic corporate lawyer named Marcus, didn't even blink when he said it. He didn't soften his tone or offer any comforting platitudes. He just looked across the polished wooden table at me with a completely neutral, professional expression, patiently waiting for my exhausted brain to fully process the catastrophic reality of our situation. I stared blankly at my trembling hands resting in my lap. My own mother, the woman who had packed my grade school lunches, the woman who had taught me how to tie my shoes, was now sitting squarely in the crosshairs of severe, life-altering criminal charges. It honestly felt like I was trapped inside a bizarre, poorly written television drama, but the cold sweat pooling at the base of my neck and the violent shaking of my knees were entirely, terrifyingly real. Marcus leaned forward in his leather chair, deliberately folding his hands on top of his yellow legal pad to command the room's attention. He broke the heavy silence, his voice low but completely uncompromising. He explained in agonizingly clear terms that this was no longer just a toxic family dispute that we could quietly sweep under the rug to keep the peace at Thanksgiving. By intentionally hacking into an old hard drive, maliciously altering file creation dates, and actively creating fake evidence to prove I had committed plagiarism, Victoria had crossed a massive, undeniable legal boundary. She didn't just spread a nasty, jealous rumor to our relatives over a cup of afternoon tea. She had systematically and obsessively fabricated a massive digital paper trail. She did this with the explicit, calculated intent to completely destroy my professional reputation and violently tear down everything I had built. Marcus made it crystal clear to everyone in the room that this deliberate fabrication constitutes defamation and fraud. And in the ruthless corporate world, especially when dealing with massive international game publishers and high-profile industry awards, massive fraud is absolutely not something you can just apologize for and walk away from without serious consequences. David, my boss and the co-founder of our indie studio, sat next to me, violently running his hands over his face in deep, exhausted frustration. The bags under his eyes were dark purple, making him look like he had aged 10 years in a single week. None of us had slept properly since the anonymous emails first hit our inboxes. He turned his chair to face me, his expression a heartbreaking, complex mixture of deep personal sympathy and sheer, unadulterated desperation. He gently but firmly reminded me of what was actually, tangibly at stake here. It wasn't just my shiny glass Best Narrative Award or my fragile personal pride on the line anymore. Our massive game publisher was actively threatening to freeze all financial funding for our highly anticipated expansion pack. If the publisher pulled their crucial financial backing because they genuinely believed my mother's fabricated lies, our small, passionate indie studio would immediately go completely bankrupt. The 5 dedicated people who had worked alongside me for 3 grueling years would instantly lose their jobs, their hard-earned livelihoods, and their health insurance. The 1 million copies we had proudly sold would forever be tainted by a massive, ugly scandal. My mother's blind, irrational hatred for my independence was actively about to destroy the innocent lives of 4 amazing people who had fully supported me when she absolutely refused to. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look Marcus in the eye. I asked him what our actual, realistic options were moving forward. My own voice sounded hollow and distant, like it was coming from a stranger standing on the other side of the room. Marcus didn't sugarcoat a single detail. He told me, flat out, that the only guaranteed way to save the studio from financial ruin, clear my name with a furious publisher, and secure my entire future was to take the IT forensic expert's explosive, damning report and hand it directly over to the authorities. We had to file a formal, binding police report. We had to legally, publicly expose her malicious actions. If we desperately tried to handle this horrific betrayal privately within the family, the publisher would never fully believe our side of the story. They demanded absolute, undeniable legal proof that the plagiarism claims were a malicious, fabricated hoax designed to sabotage our massive sales. And the only way to get that ironclad proof officially recognized by a multi-million-dollar corporation was to drag the entire ugly truth through the formal criminal justice system. That I left the studio early that afternoon feeling completely, entirely numb from head to toe. I drove back to my tiny, cramped apartment in total, suffocating silence, the car radio turned off, my exhausted mind racing in a million different, agonizing directions at once. I walked inside, dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, and just collapsed onto my cheap, worn-out sofa. I sat there completely motionless as the sun slowly went down outside my window, plunging the small living room into deep shadows. I looked across the dark room at the heavy, beautiful glass Best Narrative Award sitting quietly on my desk, catching the faint, orange glow of the streetlights outside. I sat there and thought about the grueling, miserable years of eating cheap instant ramen for dinner every single night. I remembered wearing cheap winter gloves indoors while typing code because I couldn't afford to fix the apartment's heating. I remembered working myself to the absolute bone, sacrificing my social life and my sleep just to prove to the world, and to her, that I wasn't a pathetic failure. I had built a beautiful, incredibly successful life out of absolutely nothing. And my mother, the one person on this earth who was biologically supposed to be my biggest, loudest cheerleader, was actively trying to burn it all to the ground using forged documents and blatant, malicious lies. For 3 agonizing, torturous days, I didn't leave my apartment at all. I barely ate anything, surviving on tap water and half a box of stale crackers. I just paced back and forth across my worn-out living room carpet, wrestling violently with the most horrific, soul-crushing guilt imaginable. How do you actually pick up a phone and call the police on your own mother? How do you sit back and watch the woman who raised you, who bought your childhood clothes, get aggressively investigated for severe, intentional crimes? I kept hearing her cold, heartless voice echoing in my head from when I had confronted her earlier that week. She hadn't shown a single, microscopic ounce of remorse or guilt. She had looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain, and coldly told me I was too arrogant and needed to be brought down. She genuinely, truly believed she was morally right. She believed that destroying my entire life, humiliating me globally, and ruining my friends' careers was a perfectly justified punishment for daring to succeed without her explicit permission. She didn't care if I ended up completely homeless, financially bankrupt, and universally hated by the gaming industry. She just wanted to win the sick, twisted game in her head that on the crisp morning of the 4th day, I finally woke up, and the heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt was completely, entirely gone. In its place was a sharp, diamond-hard, blinding clarity that took my breath away. I sat up in bed and realized, with absolute certainty, that protecting her meant actively participating in my own total destruction. If I let her get away with this massive, illegal sabotage, I would be permanently validating every single horrible, emotionally abusive thing she had ever done to me throughout my entire life. I would be loudly telling her that it was perfectly okay to ruin my life and the innocent lives of my best friends at the studio just to satisfy her twisted, wildly controlling ego. I walked into my small bathroom, splashed freezing cold water onto my pale face, and stared deeply at my reflection in the mirror. I wasn't a scared, obedient, easily manipulated child anymore. I was a highly successful, independent, award-winning woman, and I was absolutely, permanently done being her emotional punching bag that I quickly got dressed and drove straight back to the indie studio. The morning sun felt uncharacteristically bright, and warm as I confidently walked through the heavy glass front doors. David and Marcus were already sitting in the small conference room, nursing giant cups of black coffee, anxiously looking over the digital forensic files for what must have been the 100th time. I walked in, closed the heavy door firmly behind me to shut out the noise of the main office, and sat down at the head of the long table. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and told him to make the call immediately. I told him to officially authorize the formal police complaint on behalf of the studio and hand every single piece of our digital evidence directly over to the local authorities. I wanted her fully, ruthlessly investigated for the fake evidence she created to prove I plagiarized. I wanted her held completely and legally accountable for the massive defamation and fraud. Marcus nodded solemnly, his face completely serious, immediately opening his silver laptop to finalize the massive stack of legal paperwork. He calmly explained the intense logistics of what would happen next in the real world. Because she had actively distributed these highly sensitive, forged documents to external businesses to intentionally cause catastrophic financial harm, the police would aggressively investigate her for forged documents and sabotaging business contracts. The specialized cybercrime division would need to physically secure her desktop computer and all her external hard drives completely by surprise, before she ever realized we were onto her and frantically tried to delete the original, manipulated files. They absolutely needed the physical, tangible evidence to completely solidify the criminal case against her. Perfect timing was going to be absolutely everything. David nervously suggested we just let the police handle it quietly on a random Tuesday morning to avoid a massive scene, but a sudden, intense thought crossed my racing mind. My mother had intentionally humiliated me in front of our entire family at that dinner. She had purposefully used a captive audience to try and completely crush my spirit and belittle my massive achievements. She had smiled smugly while my cousin Chloe called my life's incredible work childish, and she had basked in the toxic power she felt by putting me down in front of everyone I knew. If this entire nightmare was going to end, if the absolute truth was finally going to come out into the light, it needed to happen exactly where she started it. It needed to happen in front of the exact same people who had laughed at me and dismissed my life. I looked at David and Marcus, my heart pounding against my ribs with a terrifying, exhilarating mix of fear and absolute, unbreakable resolve. I told them I knew exactly when and where the police should step in to secure the evidence. We were going to do it this weekend, right in the middle of the massive Sunday family gathering she had spent weeks planning at her house. I spent the entire weekend pacing around my small apartment, mentally preparing for what I was about to do. Marcus and the local cybercrime division had moved incredibly fast, far faster than I ever expected. They completely understood the severe urgency of the situation because my mother had targeted massive corporate contracts. They secured a judge's signature for a search and seizure warrant by Friday evening. The coordinated plan was that plainclothes detectives and uniformed officers would stage their vehicles a few blocks away from my parents' house on Sunday afternoon. I would go inside, initiate the conversation, and the police would move in exactly 15 minutes later to secure the premises and confiscate her computers before she could hit the delete button on Sunday afternoon. The weather was annoyingly perfect. It was sunny and crisp, the kind of beautiful weekend day that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen. I drove back to my parents' house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. When I pulled into the familiar neighborhood, I saw a dark, unmarked sedan parked casually near the corner of the street. I knew immediately who was inside it. I parked my car in the driveway, right behind my aunt's silver SUV. The driveway was completely packed with cars, exactly like it was during that miserable dinner where this nightmare first started. I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, listening to the rhythmic ticking of my car's engine cooling down, trying to steady my rapidly beating heart. I was about to detonate a massive bomb in the middle of my own family did I finally force myself to open the car door and walk up the front path. I didn't bother knocking. I just turned the knob and walked straight inside. The house was filled with the warm, comforting smells of roasted chicken and garlic. The television was playing softly in the background, broadcasting a random weekend sports game. I walked past the entryway and stepped directly into the large living room. My Aunt Sarah and Uncle Bob were sitting on the expensive leather sofa, sipping iced tea. My cousin Chloe, the high-powered corporate lawyer who had mocked my career just weeks ago, was standing near the fireplace, tapping away on her smartphone. And there she was, Victoria. She was standing by the kitchen island, arranging an expensive platter of cheese and crackers, looking completely relaxed and perfectly put together. The moment my shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up. The casual, happy Sunday atmosphere evaporated instantly. Nobody expected me to show up. They all knew I had left the celebration dinner in a hurry, and I hadn't spoken to anyone in the family since. "Naomi," my Aunt Sarah said, her voice filled with polite surprise. "We didn't know you were coming today. Have you eaten?" I ignored her entirely. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't say hello to anyone. I walked straight into the absolute center of the living room, planted my feet firmly on the carpet, and stared directly at my mother. I didn't scream and I didn't cry. My voice was dangerously calm, completely void of any emotion. I asked my mother in front of the entire family why she had intentionally hacked into my old files and sent fabricated evidence to my publisher. The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint cheering from the sports game on the television. My Uncle Bob lowered his glass of iced tea, looking completely bewildered. Chloe stopped typing on her phone and slowly looked up, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Naomi, what on earth are you talking about?" Uncle Bob asked, looking back and forth between me and my mother. "Hacking files? Publishers? What is going on?" I didn't break eye contact with Victoria. I just stood there, waiting for her to speak. I genuinely thought that having the entire family watching her would force her to show at least a tiny fraction of guilt or embarrassment. I thought the sheer, undeniable reality of being caught red-handed in front of her sister and her niece would make her crack, but I was wrong. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she let out a short, dismissive sigh, picked up a small cheese knife, and calmly continued arranging her appetizer platter. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance, as if I had just tracked mud onto her clean carpet. She openly admitted to doing it, loudly declaring that she was just teaching me a lesson. "A lesson?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, the absolute shock registering in my brain. "Yes, a lesson," Victoria snapped, finally turning to fully face me, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked completely defiant and entirely proud of herself. "You came into this house last week parading that stupid glass trophy around like you were the most important person on the planet. You are too arrogant, Naomi. You write silly little games for a living, but you act like you cured a disease. I just wanted people to know the truth. I wanted them to know you aren't the special genius everyone thinks you are. You needed to be brought down a peg, and I simply did what needed to be done." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words hung heavily in the air. She genuinely believed she had the moral high ground. She believed that committing massive, intentional fraud to destroy her daughter's entire life was simply an act of standard parenting. Chloe stepped forward, her lawyer instincts finally kicking in as she processed what Victoria had just proudly confessed to. "Aunt Victoria," Chloe said slowly, her voice laced with sudden, genuine concern. "Did you actually send forged documents to a corporate entity? Did you fabricate evidence to intentionally disrupt a commercial business contract?" "Oh, please, Chloe, don't use your fancy courtroom words with me," Victoria scoffed, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "It's not a real business. It's a bunch of kids playing on computers. I just sent a few emails to show them she wasn't that talented. Nobody actually cares about that nonsense." "I care," I said loudly, cutting through her delusion. "And my studio cares, and the massive international publisher who is currently threatening to pull millions of dollars in funding cares." Victoria rolled her eyes again. "Stop being so dramatic, Naomi. You'll find another little job. You'll survive. This was just a necessary lesson." I stood there, looking at the woman who had given birth to me, realizing that she was completely, irrevocably broken inside. There was no reaching her. There was no reasoning with her. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over me. The crushing guilt I had wrestled with all weekend vanished entirely. "You're right, Mother," I said, my voice completely steady. "It is a lesson." I took a slow step backward toward the front door. "And I'm teaching you a lesson, too." Victoria frowned, genuinely confused by my response. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising in irritation. Before she could say another word, 3 loud, heavy, authoritative knocks slammed against the front door, shaking the wooden frame. "Police! Open the door!" A deep, commanding voice shouted from outside, the color instantly, violently drained from Victoria's face. She dropped the small cheese knife onto the granite counter with a sharp clatter. Uncle Bob jumped up from the sofa, his eyes wide with absolute panic, and hurried to unlock the front door. The moment the door opened, the police stepped inside. 3 fully uniformed police officers quickly entered the house, immediately taking control of the space. They were closely followed by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing dark jackets. The entire family was completely paralyzed with shock. My Aunt Sarah let out a loud gasp and covered her mouth with both hands, sinking back into the leather sofa. Chloe instinctively took a step back, raising her hands slightly, as if to distance herself from the entire situation. The lead detective bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the main staircase, loudly instructing 2 of the officers to follow him up to the 2nd floor to secure the home office. They needed to get their hands on her desktop computer, her laptop, and any external hard drives before she had a chance to realize what was happening and destroy the digital evidence of her crimes. "Excuse me, what are you doing in my house?" Victoria shrieked, her arrogant facade finally crumbling into sheer, unfiltered panic. She rushed out from behind the kitchen island, pointing a trembling finger at the officers. "You can't just walk in here. Get out of my house right now." One of the officers calmly stepped directly into Victoria's path, blocking her from reaching the stairs. He held up a thick stack of folded, official papers. He looked down at her with absolutely zero sympathy. He sternly informed her that they were actively executing a cybercrime search warrant and that she was being investigated for forging documents and sabotaging business contracts. Victoria froze. The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She looked frantically from the police officer to my uncle, to Chloe, and finally, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine. The absolute realization of what she had done, and what was about to happen to her, finally shattered her delusions. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely unreadable expression, did not raise his voice or show any emotion as he stepped further into the living room. He held out a thick, heavily stamped piece of paper toward my mother. He stated in a clear, authoritative tone that they had a judge-signed warrant and that Victoria was officially being investigated for forging documents and sabotaging business contracts. Victoria's hands shook violently as she instinctively took the paperwork. She didn't even look down to read it. The heavy, intimidating sound of police boots echoing on the hardwood floors of the main staircase filled the silence of the house. The officers were heading straight up to her pristine, perfectly organized home office. They were entering the exact sanctuary where she had spent hours meticulously crafting my absolute destruction. The television in the background was still quietly broadcasting the weekend sports game, providing a bizarrely normal, cheerful soundtrack to the total collapse of my family. My cousin Chloe, whose corporate lawyer instincts finally overrode her initial shock, practically snatched the search warrant out of Victoria's trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon rapidly, tracking the lines of text with practiced speed. Within seconds, all the color completely drained from Chloe's perfectly tanned face. She looked up, her expression completely transformed from her usual arrogant smirk to sheer, unfiltered horror. "Aunt Victoria, what exactly did you do?" Chloe asked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual condescending tone. She sounded genuinely panicked. "This isn't a joke or a misunderstanding. This is a felony search and seizure warrant. They have a judge's direct authorization to confiscate all your personal electronics, your hard drives, your network routers, everything. They are accusing you of severe corporate sabotage and highly calculated digital fraud." Victoria stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the room. The arrogant, smug woman who had proudly declared she was just teaching me a lesson just moments ago was rapidly vanishing. "It was just a lesson. It was a family matter. I just sent a few anonymous emails to her little game company to show them she wasn't a genius. They can't bring the police into my house for sending an email." "You didn't just send a few mean emails, Mother," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her frantic excuses. I stood completely still in the center of the living room, feeling an overwhelming, chilling sense of calm. You intentionally hacked into my old college backup files from an external hard drive you kept in this house. You purposefully altered the digital timestamps on those files. You maliciously created a completely fake manuscript to frame me for intellectual property theft. And then you sent that fabricated evidence to a massive international game publisher with the explicit intent to financially ruin my studio and get my award revoked. That is a massive, severe crime, and you left a massive digital footprint. My Aunt Sarah, who had been completely silent until now, suddenly let out a loud, agonizing wail and buried her face into a decorative throw pillow on the sofa, weeping openly. Uncle Bob stepped forward, his face flushed bright red with a chaotic mix of intense anger and sheer, public embarrassment. He looked at me, his hands held up in a desperate pleading gesture. "Naomi, please," Uncle Bob begged, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the situation. "She's your mother. You grew up in this house. Can't you just tell these officers it's a huge, stupid family misunderstanding? Tell them to stop the search. We can sit down like adults, figure this out, and handle it privately. We don't need the police digging through our lives." I looked at my uncle, feeling a sharp pang of pity for him, but I slowly shook my head. "I can't, Uncle Bob. Even if I wanted to drop it, I don't have the power to do that anymore. The studio's corporate lawyers and the publisher's aggressive legal team are the ones pressing these charges forward. She didn't just hurt my feelings. She actively attacked a multi-million-dollar commercial business contract. She threatened the livelihoods of my entire team. It is entirely out of my hands now. She made this a legal issue the second she fabricated that evidence." Before Uncle Bob could argue further, the heavy footsteps returned. 2 uniformed officers walked slowly and deliberately down the main staircase. One of them was carrying Victoria's sleek, expensive silver laptop sealed inside a thick, clear plastic evidence bag. The other officer was carrying 2 black external hard drives and a large, heavy desktop computer tower completely disconnected from her office desk. Seeing her personal property being physically carried away in police custody finally broke whatever fragile denial Victoria was still clinging to. She let out a guttural, horrifying scream that made my stomach drop. "Put those down right now!" she shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the high living room ceiling. "You can't take my computer. All my personal files are on there. My banking information, my passwords, my family photos, my tax returns, everything is on that machine. Give it back to me." She lunged forward, desperately trying to grab the plastic evidence bag containing her laptop right out of the officer's hands. The lead detective immediately stepped directly in front of her, firmly holding his hand up to physically block her path. His face was completely stern, and his posture was rigid and uncompromising. He warned her in a loud, booming voice that if she interfered with the execution of a lawful search warrant or attempted to touch, tamper with, or destroy the seized evidence in any way, he would immediately place her in handcuffs and arrest her for the obstruction of justice right there in front of her family. Victoria froze instantly, her arms suspended awkwardly in the air. For the very first time in my 27 years of existence, I saw my mother completely and utterly powerless. The absolute, terrifying control she had constantly wielded over this entire family for decades was instantly shattered by the undeniable, heavy reality of the law. She shrank back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, her eyes wide with genuine terror. The detective calmly but firmly explained the harsh reality of her immediate future. He told her that they were taking all the confiscated hardware directly to the county's specialized cybercrime lab. They were going to completely extract and analyze the digital data to formally prove that Victoria was the individual responsible for the forged documents and the deliberate sabotage of my commercial business contracts. He strongly advised her to stop talking, to retain an aggressive criminal defense attorney immediately, and to expect formal felony charges to be filed by the district attorney's office within the coming week. Desperation entirely took over. Victoria turned her tear-filled, wide eyes to Chloe. "Chloe, please. You're a brilliant lawyer. You have to help me right now. You have to stop them from walking out of my house with my things. Tell them they are making a massive procedural mistake. Do something." Chloe, the woman who had happily mocked my career just weeks prior, took 2 large, deliberate steps backward, physically distancing herself from my mother as if Victoria suddenly had a highly contagious, lethal disease. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. I am a corporate tax lawyer, Aunt Victoria, not a criminal defense attorney. And even if I was qualified, I would never, ever take this toxic case. You just committed federal-level wire fraud and corporate defamation against my own cousin. You intentionally ruined business relationships. I cannot be associated with this kind of blatant, malicious criminality. You are entirely on your own. Hearing Chloe, her absolute favorite niece, the highly successful woman she constantly compared me to in order to make me feel small, completely abandon her in her darkest moment was the final, devastating blow. Victoria physically crumpled. She collapsed heavily onto the nearest wooden kitchen barstool, burying her face deeply in her shaking hands, and began sobbing uncontrollably. The arrogant, untouchable woman was completely gone, replaced by a terrified suspect who finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of her actions that I stood completely silently in the center of the destroyed living room, watching the police officers carry the plastic evidence bags out the front door and load them into the trunks of their waiting vehicles. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel a triumphant, glowing sense of victory. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I walked out of my parents' house without saying another word to anyone. The front door clicked shut firmly behind me, and the heavy, normal Sunday silence of a suburban neighborhood wrapped around me like a thick blanket. I got into my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a long time, staring blindly at the empty street ahead. I didn't cry. I think I was far too emotionally drained and completely exhausted to produce a single tear at that moment. I just started the engine, put the car in drive, and slowly drove away from the place I used to call home, knowing with absolute, unwavering certainty that I would never, ever step foot inside that house again. The next few weeks were an absolute whirlwind of intense legal meetings, formal police interviews, and massive corporate damage control. The county's specialized cybercrime lab didn't take very long to completely rip through my mother's confiscated electronics. They found absolutely everything they needed. They found her disturbing, highly specific internet search history, detailing exactly how she looked up methods to alter digital document timestamps and fake file creation dates. They found the original, unedited drafts of my old college notes saved on her hard drive, sitting right next to the maliciously manipulated versions she had sent to my publisher. They even found the drafted, highly aggressive anonymous emails saved directly in her outbox before she blasted them out to the entire gaming industry. The digital evidence was completely undeniable, explicitly proving that her actions constituted severe defamation and massive digital fraud. She had left a massive, easily traceable digital paper trail, proving exactly what she had done to intentionally sabotage my commercial business contracts, armed with the official, heavily stamped preliminary police report and the undeniable digital forensic evidence. David, Marcus, and I immediately flew out to the massive international game publisher's corporate headquarters. We sat in a massive, sterile glass boardroom overlooking the busy city and slid the official law enforcement documents across the polished wooden table to their aggressive legal team. It was the most stressful, agonizing hour of my entire life, waiting in complete silence for them to carefully read through the grim, undeniable details of my mother's calculated sabotage. But as soon as their lead attorney finished reading the cybercrime unit's conclusive, factual findings, the entire atmosphere in the room completely shifted. The publisher immediately dropped all their aggressive threats to pull our financial funding. They officially confirmed right then and there that our highly anticipated expansion pack was fully greenlit and our massive financial backing was entirely safe. Because of this undeniable proof, I successfully kept my career. Furthermore, the Indie Game Festival organizers sent me a formal, highly apologetic email later that same afternoon, clearly stating that their internal review was officially closed. They publicly confirmed that my Best Narrative Award was permanently mine, and that the horrific plagiarism allegations were entirely fabricated by a malicious third party. With my professional reputation fully cleared and legally secured, our indie studio released a very careful, professionally worded public statement to the press. We didn't explicitly name my mother, as the criminal investigation was still highly active and sensitive, but we clearly stated that the plagiarism rumors were the absolute result of a malicious, coordinated, an entirely fabricated digital attack. We prominently attached the official confirmation from the festival organizers to prove my innocence. The gaming community, which had been so incredibly quick to aggressively tear me down just weeks prior, immediately pivoted. Major online streamers and prominent journalists who had made long videos criticizing my character quickly issued massive, highly public apologies. They started streaming and promoting the game again with entirely renewed enthusiasm and fierce loyalty. Because of the massive, renewed public interest and the overwhelming, protective support from the community, our game continued to be a massive success. We actually saw a massive, unexpected spike in digital sales that week, entirely securing the small studio's financial future for the next several years. The team was safe. My writing was safe. We had survived the absolute worst-case scenario, but while my professional life was rapidly and completely healing, my personal life was an absolute, toxic disaster zone. My cell phone essentially did not stop ringing for 2 solid weeks. It wasn't journalists or excited fans calling me anymore, it was my extended family. Uncle Bob, Aunt Sarah, and various other relatives constantly bombarded me with incoming text messages, frantic voicemails, and angry, highly emotional emails. They desperately tried to guilt-trip me into calling the district attorney to magically drop the severe felony charges against Victoria. They completely ignored the massive, catastrophic damage she had intentionally tried to inflict on my life, my finances, and my friends' innocent livelihoods. They just kept angrily repeating that she was family, that she was my mother, and that I was completely destroying her entire life over a simple, stupid misunderstanding that I remember answering one specific phone call from Uncle Bob late on a Tuesday night. His voice was thick with anger and disbelief. He yelled at me, demanding to know how I could sleep at night, knowing my own mother was facing actual prison time. I had to explain to him, over and over again, until my voice was completely hoarse, that I did not have a magical button to stop the criminal justice system. I clearly told him that the state was aggressively prosecuting her for severe digital fraud and the malicious sabotage of commercial business contracts, not me. I told him that even if I went down to the police station and begged the judge on my hands and knees, the massive game publisher and the local authorities were not going to simply drop a massive felony case just because we shared the same last name. She had committed a serious, highly documented crime, and she was going to face the severe, life-altering legal consequences of her own deliberate, calculated actions. But Uncle Bob and the rest of the family simply refused to listen to basic logic. They didn't care about the undeniable facts, the police reports, or the massive financial risk my entire studio had faced. They just wanted things to immediately go back to normal. They wanted me to just roll over, accept the horrible, life-altering abuse, and let Victoria get away with trying to permanently ruin me, just so they wouldn't have to deal with the ugly, uncomfortable reality of a massive criminal trial in the family. Every single time I answered the phone, it was just another relative screaming at me, loudly calling me ungrateful, ruthless, and unbelievably cruel. They genuinely acted as if I was the evil villain for simply surviving her vicious, calculated attack that it became incredibly, painfully clear to me that these people did not actually love me. They didn't respect me, they didn't care about my hard work, and they certainly didn't care about my personal well-being. They only cared about protecting the toxic family image and keeping Victoria completely comfortable, regardless of who she completely destroyed in the process. I realized that if I wanted to continue moving forward, if I wanted to actually enjoy my success and live a peaceful, truly happy life, I couldn't keep dragging this heavy, suffocating anchor behind me. So, I made the hardest, most necessary decision of my entire life. I sat down at my small kitchen table one evening, looked at the massive list of angry missed calls from my relatives, and I completely cut off all contact. I permanently blocked Uncle Bob's phone number. I blocked Aunt Sarah. I blocked my cousin Chloe. I went through every single social media platform and systematically removed every single family member who had ever taken Victoria's side or tried to make me feel guilty for simply defending my own life. I changed my personal cell phone number, updated my emergency contacts at the studio, and explicitly instructed my apartment building's security not to let anyone from my family into the lobby under any circumstances. I built a massive, impenetrable wall between my new, highly successful life and the toxic, miserable people who had desperately tried to tear it down that I fully expected to feel incredibly guilty. I expected to feel entirely alone and completely isolated from the world. But as I pressed the final block button on my phone and set it down on the wooden table, I didn't feel any of those negative things. I just took a deep, clear breath, and for the first time in my entire 27 years of existence, I felt completely, genuinely free. The heavy, suffocating weight of my mother's constant, bitter judgment and the family's endless, toxic expectations was finally gone. I was completely unburdened, entirely safe, and absolutely ready to step into the incredibly bright future I had built with my own two hands. The silence that followed in the weeks after I permanently blocked my extended family was not the terrifying, isolating void that I had always imagined it would be. Instead, it was the most incredibly peaceful, productive, and deeply healing period of my entire adult life. I didn't wake up every single morning with a heavy, anxious knot in my stomach, wondering what passive-aggressive text message was waiting for me on my phone. I didn't spend my weekends mentally preparing for exhausting, toxic family gatherings where my career and my life choices would be casually mocked over a plate of roast beef. By completely removing myself from their toxic ecosystem, I finally gave myself the space to actually breathe, to exist without constantly needing to defend my right to be happy. That I poured all of my renewed, intensely focused energy directly back into the indie studio, and the results were absolutely incredible. Because the massive international publisher had officially dropped all their threats, and the festival organizers had completely cleared my name, I was able to fully keep my career. I didn't have to start over from scratch. I didn't have to desperately hunt for freelance copywriting gigs, or go back to eating cheap instant ramen in a freezing, cramped apartment. I walked into the studio every single day with a profound sense of gratitude, sitting down at my desk alongside David and the rest of the incredible team who had fought so fiercely to protect me. We spent the next several months working grueling but deeply rewarding hours to finish the massive expansion pack for our game. We poured all of our leftover stress, our passion, and our absolute sheer willpower into the creative process. When the expansion pack finally launched globally, the public response was nothing short of phenomenal. The gaming community, who now knew the full, unbelievable story of the malicious sabotage attempt against our small studio, rallied behind us with a fierce, protective loyalty that brought tears to my eyes. The game continued to be a massive, undeniable success. We broke our previous digital sales records within the first 48 hours of the launch. We were completely financially secure, not just for the next year, but for the foreseeable future. I was invited to speak at even more prestigious gaming conventions and industry panels, and this time, there was no looming threat of someone trying to violently tear me down from the shadows. I stood on those brightly lit stages, looking out at thousands of passionate fans, and I finally felt like I genuinely deserved to be exactly where I was. While my life was rapidly moving forward into a bright, incredibly successful future, my mother's life was completely, entirely unraveling. Through Marcus, our studio's sharp and highly efficient corporate lawyer, I received the strictly necessary, completely objective legal updates regarding the ongoing situation. I didn't ask for personal details, and I certainly didn't reach out to anyone to check on her well-being because I had completely cut off contact with my mother. Marcus informed me that the local authorities and the county's specialized cybercrime division did not hold back. Because of the massive, undeniable trail of digital evidence she had carelessly left behind on her hard drives, Victoria was formally investigated for forging documents and sabotaging business contracts. It wasn't just a minor slap on the wrist or a simple fine. The district attorney aggressively pursued the severe felony charges because her calculated actions had directly threatened a multi-million-dollar commercial enterprise. She was forced to hire an incredibly expensive criminal defense attorney, draining her own personal savings just to keep herself out of a jail cell. From what little I gathered through the cold, formal legal briefings, her entire pristine, perfectly crafted suburban reputation was completely destroyed. Her neighbors knew exactly why the police had raided her house that Sunday afternoon. Her friends at her upscale country club stopped calling her. The extended family, who had fought so hard to defend her and guilt-trip me, suddenly realized the massive, humiliating public scandal they were now tied to. Victoria was entirely isolated, trapped in the massive, destructive legal mess she had meticulously built with her own 2 hands. She had desperately wanted to humble me, to violently bring me down a peg and teach me a cruel lesson, but she had only managed to completely and permanently destroy her own life. Sometimes, late at night, I sit quietly at my desk in my new, much larger apartment and look at the heavy, beautiful glass Best Narrative Award. The award that she had loudly called stupid and embarrassing in front of everyone. I look at it, and I don't feel any anger anymore. I don't feel the sharp, burning betrayal that used to keep me awake until the early hours of the morning. I just feel a profound, quiet sense of clarity. For my entire life, I had bent over backwards trying to earn her approval. I had exhausted myself trying to prove that my passions were valid, that my writing was real, and that I was a person worthy of her maternal pride. I thought that if I just achieved enough, if I just became successful enough, she would finally look at me with love instead of bitter disappointment. But sitting there, watching my name shine in the glass reflection, I finally understood the fundamental, tragic truth about my mother. Her cruelty wasn't actually about the video games. It wasn't about the money, or the industry, or her strict, traditional views on what constitutes a real career. It was entirely about absolute control. As long as I was struggling, as long as I was poor and desperately seeking her validation, she felt powerful. The moment I won that award, the moment I sold 1 million copies and secured my own independent future, I became a massive, terrifying threat to her fragile ego. She couldn't handle a version of the world where I didn't desperately need her to survive. I reached out and gently traced the engraved lettering on the glass trophy, smiling softly to myself in the quiet room. I had survived her absolute worst, most malicious attempt to ruin me, and I had come out on the other side completely unbroken. I finally realized that my mother always feared I would fail, but it turns out what she feared most was me succeeding without her.